So I'm going to just provide a real high-level overview of the sustainable management criteria that was developed for the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And as Kristen alluded to, we've been working, with a lot of the local interests to develop, to review all the data that's available that Max just went over. All of that information that we have on the basin, whether it's well data or hydrogeologic data, geology, land use, all that stuff really plays an important part in how we set sustainable management criteria. And so this overview is, again, it's going to be very high level. Please, if you've got more in-depth questions, as Max and Kristen indicated, give them a call, but also review the document. The document, right now the GSP is several hundred pages long, and I'm going to try to squeeze about 150 of those pages into the next 5 minutes or so, or 10 minutes. So with that in mind, we have to develop a sustainability goal for the basin, and I'll go through this on the next slide, but really it's got kind of, I always like to say, it's kind of our mom and apple pie kind of statement. This is the good things that we want to do in the basin. The statement is pretty general, but it's really predicated on all the detail that we see in the defining undesirable results, developing minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. And we do the sustainability goal really applies to the whole plan as a whole. And so then as we dig further down, we have to address each of the sustainability indicators. And for each of those, we have to develop an undesirable result, a minimum threshold, and a measurable objective. So the definition for sustainability really kind of keys on our undesirable results. And I touched on this a little bit. But we developed the definition for an undesirable results for each of the indicators: the lowering of groundwater levels, the reduction of groundwater storage, degradation of water quality to an extent, I'll come back to that, land subsidence, depletion of interconnected surface waters, and seawater intrusion. So seawater intrusion, as Kristen indicated, we've taken that off the table. We don't really have that issue. That's more of a coastal issue. But then for water quality, I'll just note that we didn't develop specific criteria for this plan for water quality because there's already a lot of programs that manage water quality within the basin. And we want to acknowledge the work that they do, the standards that they set, the continued monitoring that they do. And our goal is to make sure that we understand what's happening with water quality through those programs. Annually, if not more often, review the results of those monitoring efforts and how people are meeting their water quality standards, how it's affecting land uses. And then we don't see where there's a connection between changes in groundwater level and changes in water quality right now. But if we do see that going forward, then we would start to build in more robust criteria for managing water quality along with groundwater levels. So we, again, a lot of detail in the plan. This is really a kind of quick overview of how we set undesirable results. But the other key point here, again, is that when we trigger an undesirable result at the basin level, then that really is an indication that we're not managing the basin properly or at sustainability. So that's what we're trying to avoid. Next slide, please. So measurable objectives. So this measurable objective is kind of a metric that we want to try to maintain the groundwater level or groundwater conditions at. And I'll use groundwater elevation and storage, which we tie together as an example. So for an objective, for the measurable objective, it kind of represents the point, groundwater elevation that we generally want to be at most of the time as a long-term average, or in our case, we're looking at a 5-year average. So if our groundwater levels are kind of, as on an average basis, are at a certain level, and it's defined at each monitoring well, if it's maintaining that elevation, then that's kind of where we want to be. Again, it'll go up and down on an annual basis because of fluctuations in use and changes in hydrology, things like that. Again, we're experiencing that today. But we want to see the long-term average kind of stay at what we call the measurable objective. And so that's something that's kind of a guidepost, if you will. So we want to, again, be proactive about trying to make sure that that occurs throughout the basin. When we're seeing deviations, significant deviations from that average, then we really want to take a hard look at that and try to figure out how to correct that issue. it's kind of the, as I said, it's a guidance and hopefully an early warning signal for us as well. Go ahead, next slide. So the minimum threshold, so this is where the teeth is, and so, or teeth are. So minimum thresholds are and I'll use groundwater elevations again as an example. In this case, it's the minimum elevation that we want to see in a representative monitoring well before that avoids any impacts to users or uses of groundwater. And so for every monitoring well, every Sigma representative monitoring well, and I'll show you what those are, we've identified a measurable objective, the average point. We've identified a minimum threshold that represents the point that we don't want to go below. And typically for groundwater elevations right now, that means it's the low point of record, which, as Max alluded to, is probably about the 77 period. So it's that generally in that realm that we want to set this minimum threshold. And so what does it mean if we violate a minimum threshold? If we violate a minimum threshold at an individual well that's being monitored for this purpose, then it means we have a local issue, hopefully just a local issue, that we need to try to correct. Within each management area of the subbasin, we have a criteria that says if a management area has 51% of their wells exceed their minimum threshold, then that management area now becomes what we call a watch area. And there's a bigger issue there, right? So we need to be really concerned about that. But if we have 2 or more management areas hit that criteria, then we have an undesirable result. And that, again, that's saying to the county or to the state that we're not managing our basin well enough and we probably need help. And so the idea behind kind of having this growing level of violation, if you will, or exceedance of a minimum threshold is that we recognize that at times we may have small issues in places, but we want to have the ability to deal with that first at the very local level. And then maybe if that problem seems to be growing or shows a certain trend, then we'll deal with it at a kind of more regional level within the management area. And then ultimately, we may have issues that we need to deal with at the whole entire subbasin level. And so we're set up in a way that if we think we're getting close to even a single violation of the minimum threshold, we're going to jump into action. And Jack will kind of go over one of the management actions that we have to deal with that. But I want to make it clear that even though our threshold for an undesirable result is a fairly significant number of wells, we think that gives us the ability to manage that before it gets too bad that we have to turn control over to the state. But any violation of a minimum threshold is cause for concern, and it is a call to action by not only the GSA, but our partners within the GSA to help manage that situation and hopefully be able to avoid any further declines in groundwater elevation or subsidence, or water quality as we're monitoring it, or the surface water groundwater interaction. So all of this is again predicated on having representative monitoring sites. And what this map shows you, kind of different than the one that Max showed you with all the dots, we picked a subset of those wells that we can monitor going forward that will tell us whether our basin is responding the way we want to. These wells have been identified because they're representative of a broader area around them. And there's also a subset of all the wells that are monitored in the basin because there's a lot of work that goes into not only setting the threshold at each of these wells, but also reporting all of this data to the Department of Water Resources on it twice a year. And so, we certainly are going to pay attention to all the monitoring that happens in the basin and all the wells. All of that's very helpful for us, but we've only selected a subset of those that we call our Sigma representative wells that really are kind of the indicators for the basin as a whole. The different colors on the map are the different types of monitoring wells. So we have wells that are used for groundwater elevation and storage. And then we also have wells that are used for the surface water groundwater interaction. So we're trying to measure how our groundwater levels are affecting stream flow essentially. And we want to be able to maintain, again, that kind of historic condition that supports habitat along these aquatic corridors, whether it's Cache Creek, Poudre Creek, some of the sloughs and other things in the area that are important for those other environmental beneficial uses. We want to make sure that we maintain a groundwater level and a connection, that periodic connection to groundwater that continues to support those critical habitats. And so again, this just shows the different wells and different types of monitoring that will happen throughout the basin.